So I wanted to take a minute before we get into the topic for today. I had a question recently about, what is my process for writing these talks? And the person that asked was sort of under the impression that, I'm slaving away, burning the midnight oil, spending all this time. But the reality is, so I walk a lot. I walk my dog several times a day and I walk for exercise 5 days a week. And that's really when I do them. And so I'll get a prompt like the one I got for today's talk from Judith, which was a wonderful prompt. And it'll just start percolating. And then when I'm walking, I carry this little pocket recorder, and I just begin to do my outline while I'm walking. I should probably just be taking in nature, but this is my process. And then when I get home, I work from that and just do an outline, a bullet point outline, and then I've been studying and practicing stuff for 35 years, so there's a fair repository of information to draw on, and it just kind of organically happens. And so if you, it, maybe it's presumptuous to think, but if you think I've been burning the midnight oil and slaving away twice a week, rest assured it's a organic and pleasant and informative process, because it always, when I have to go back and think about it, it always helps with my own practice. So that's my story. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer it. But um, I realized I'd never talked to you about that. So thank you. Anyway, let's get started. So as I said, Judith had asked me a question recently about stories, and I wanted to revisit the topic of the stories that we tell ourselves. And Judith's question had to do with how past events in our lives cause continued suffering, and is that something which is part of sort of the ego, or where does that stuff live? So I thought it was an excellent topic. It really got me thinking, and so I wanted to try to address it this morning. And apropos that, based on what I said a few minutes ago, if you have questions or thoughts about a topic, please let me know, because I'm always looking for topics. I'm always looking for those prompts to think about when I'm walking. So anything that comes up, in your life or in your practice, because, the Dharma, there's nothing in our lives that the Dharma doesn't impact or can't be understood through the lens of the Dharma. I mean, it's that broad and it's that deep. So please just shoot me an email and say, how about a talk on this topic? And I'll do my best to address it. But anyway, as I said to Judith a couple weeks ago, we had an email exchange. The essence of her question really lies in the profound insight that our histories, be they joyful or traumatic, are ultimately just stories that we internalize and then carry with us and feel like become part of us. And they really do shape the way we perceive ourselves. They shape the way we think about ourselves. So from early childhood, we are internalizing and telling ourselves stories and really embodying those stories and becoming heavily identified with those stories about who we are. And they become so deeply embedded that it really never occurs to us to question them. We sort of treat them as the absolute truth of who we are. But that's not how the Buddha saw it. These stories become the foundation of our ego. But remember, the ego has a big part of itself that is that false sense of a fixed, separate self. And so the question becomes, are these stories who we really are at our core? And I'm going to try to make the case this morning that they are not. Buddhism teaches us that clinging in all its forms, and especially clinging to the narratives about who we are, can be a primary source of suffering. And that true freedom lies in recognizing that these stories are just stories. They're not the essence or the core of who we are. Now, that said, the ego is going to push back on that. The ego is going to keep insisting that we are who we think we are. We're not just stories. This is the essence of who we are. So just note that, because you're going to get pushback within yourself. But when we cultivate our awareness, when we practice non-attachment, we begin to see how we can transcend these narratives. We can experience the spaciousness of our true nature, what the Buddha called our true nature. because remember, when he talked about this not self concept, there's not a fixed inherent entity that's Jeff or Judy or any of the rest of us. Rather, what we call ourselves, this self, this thing, is a collection of constantly changing thoughts, constantly changing emotions, differing experiences, different perceptions, different internalized narratives, and on and on. So, for instance, the stories we tell ourselves, one of my top 10 is about being the good boy, or it might be for some of us a failure or a trauma victim or whatever, are part of this ever-changing construct we call the ego. I'm not saying they're not in there, but they're part of that mix, that ever-changing mix. And yes, these narratives that we carry are rooted in real events, past or present, but they are not the entirety of who we are. They are mental formations, what the Buddha calls sankharas, is the Pali word. They are impermanent and they are conditioned by our past experiences, our fears, our aspirations, our joys, our sorrows, our self-assessments, all of that. And when we identify too strongly with these stories, when we lock onto that, we reinforce this notion of a permanent self. We reinforce this notion of a separate self, which then filters all of our experience through those stories and colors them, defines our experience. So my experiences are all filtered through this net, this filter of stories that I have about me and who I am and how I respond, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you think of someone who is heavily identified, for instance, and I've seen this a lot when I was in practice, with the role of victim. It's a common theme and one in which many people, as I said, brought to therapy when I was in practice. Their glass is always half empty. Their life is always, so that everything, that's their filter. So everything is confirmed as just another victimization of them. And the good stuff just flies right by. They don't even see it. They don't acknowledge it. They don't even know it's there. Everything is filtered through this victim stance. And this is worsened by our experience as humans of what's known as confirmation bias. Once I begin to see the world a certain way, everything begins to fit that narrative. And that becomes a real trap. So for example, if I'm operating with a victim filter, if I get a flat tire, it's not just another random event that could happen to anyone. It's somehow the universe punishing me, or this is the story of my life, or bad stuff always happens to me, or why me, or poor me, and on and on and on. And you could just see how that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy through that filter, through that lens. I've shared with you in the past my lifelong story of having to be the good boy who must strive for perfection. And that became a lens through which I viewed the world and myself. Certainly just consumed me before I found my way to this practice. And when I inevitably, as I was bound to do, fell short of that ideal, and I fell short of it daily, I suffered greatly. I'm inadequate, I'm a failure, what's wrong with me? Because I was clinging to this illusion, a rigid, self-imposed story, a rigid, self-imposed idea of who I was supposed to be. Now, yes, that story was implanted there in my childhood, but I took it in, I identified with it, and it became the governing kind of narrative in my life. This clinging is what the Buddha refers to as upadana, the attachment that leads to suffering. Those identities become that attachment. We attach to them that lead to our suffering. So the first step, to stay with my example, toward freedom was freedom from these limiting narratives was awareness, as is always the case. Okay. In my example of the good boy story, the realization that it was just a script, not an absolute truth, was a profound moment of awakening for me. It actually happened on a retreat. It just came up during my meditation. It's like, wait a minute, you've been living this your whole life. It's just another story. And that was sort of the theme of the retreat, which helped prime the pump. But excuse me, once I noticed the pattern and understood the pattern, which had been largely unconscious, but boy, it was doing its work, then I could address it with the tools of the practice. Buddhism emphasizes mindfulness as a key practice for developing this awareness. We have to pay attention. We have to observe our thoughts and emotions as they arise. We have to recognize them as transient phenomenon rather than fixed aspects of our identity, rather than fixed aspects of who we are. For example, when that feeling of inadequacy arose, like, I'm not perfect, I'm falling short of the mark, I could pause and notice, there's the good boy story again. I know what that's up to. That mischief, I know what that mischief is about. We welcome it because now we can deal with it, like we welcomed Mara to tea several weeks ago, because now I could address it and challenge it or set it aside or drop the rope or whatever metaphor you want, rather than have to continue for it to cause me suffering. As you recall, Mara, the personification of delusion and temptation, when the Buddha was becoming enlightened, it represents this metaphor represents the difficult thoughts and emotions that arise in our minds, especially our stories. So instead of resisting or avoiding or suppressing these feelings, we invite them in with curiosity and compassion. Sorry about the fire engine. By doing so, we disarm their power and we create opportunities for letting them go. And this recognition creates a gap between the thought and this sense of self, this ever-changing sense of self, which allows us within that space of awareness, to see the narrative for what it is just another story. Simply a well-entrenched, well-worn habit of the mind rather than a fundamental intrinsic truth. I find this whole notion incredibly liberating and positive. With practice, this awareness weakens the hold these stories have over us. It doesn't get rid of them, but it puts them in a different perspective. It puts some spaciousness around them. We note them, and then we simply let them go as another story. Once we identify the story, we have all kinds of options that we didn't have when it was an unconscious thing driving how we feel about itself. This does not mean we suppress them. It doesn't mean we deny these past experiences. It means we release our attachment to them, our identification to them. No longer do we have to be prisoners of these old recurring narratives or stories. But our challenge is to identify our unique individual stories, our unique individual narratives. The metaphor of dropping the rope beautifully illustrates this process. When we stop pulling against the rope, stop resisting or clinging to our narratives, we create the space for freedom and greater inner peace. Now, one practice that is really useful here is metta, especially metta for ourselves. By cultivating compassion for ourselves with metta practice, we begin to soften these harsh judgments and expectations we place on ourselves. We counter our stories. For the good boy, this might mean embracing my imperfections with greater self-kindness and even humor. And I'm going to talk about this on Saturday, but once I could laugh at the absurdity and the unreality and the impossibility of my story, I got a taste of the freedom that the Buddha promises us. And boy, I'm telling you, it was profound. Laughing at our stories is a powerful reminder to not take the ego too seriously. And we're going to just talk about laughter as a practice on Saturday. At the heart of this practice, because the talks kind of came together, rose together. At the heart of this practice is the realization that our true nature transcends the dualities of good and bad, success and failure, trauma, healing, on and on. And this is the experience of non-duality that is often talked about in Buddhism, the understanding that all phenomena are interconnected and that there's no fixed boundaries there between one state of being and another. It's constantly in motion. And this spaciousness is the essence of our core self when we tap into that space. It is not bound by the narratives of the ego, but it reflects the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and equanimity. When we rest in spacious awareness, we hold our stories lightly. We don't cling to them as defining who we are. We allow them to arise and pass away when they come up as all impermanent phenomena without letting them define us. One of the most liberating insights of Buddhism is that we are not our past. While our experience indeed shape us, they do not ultimately determine who we are. We have an option there. The story of being a trauma victim may carry with it deep pain and residual feelings, which are real, but we are no longer that victim. The trauma is not happening now. It exists as a memory. It is a story that we can choose to hold, we can bring self-compassion to, and then we can release that as part of our identity. Through mindfulness and self-compassion, we honor the pain of our past. We honor the pain of our past without letting it define us. When we invite our residual feelings, our old feelings in, and we meet them with kindness, we integrate them into our experience without clinging to them. We can only do this when we become conscious of them, and that's where our mindfulness comes in. The practice of letting go is not a rejection of the past, but it is a recognition that it does not have to bind us. In this way, we free ourselves from this cycle of suffering and we open the door to freedom. The journey of working with our stories is a deeply human one. And thankfully, Buddhism offers practical tools for navigating it. When we recognize our narratives as impermanent, as conditioned, we begin to loosen their grip on who we are. With mindfulness, with compassion, with letting go, we transcend these dualities of success and failure, good and bad, and we discover greater spaciousness. It's not about denying our history. It's about making them conscious, seeing them more clearly, and holding them lightly. You know, whether the story is that of a good boy or the story of trauma, or the story of whatever, we use our practice to smile at these narratives. We celebrate our imperfections, we laugh at them, we laugh at the constructed nature of the ego and all of its stories, and by doing so, we experience the freedom to live fully in the present moment, unburdened by this identification, by the weight of the past, and more grounded in the spacious awareness of who we truly are. So those are some more thoughts this morning on our story.